So, as the Deputy Mayor said, knife injuries under 25, brackets non-domestic abuse, close brackets, has varied. I think it's about 16.8% down at the moment. It's been 20%, so it's fluctuating a little bit, and we're watching that to make sure the reduction doesn't get less, as it were. It's from far too high a level. Is the issue. So there's no complacency from the Commissioner or anyone else saying, oh, it's down X percent, therefore that's okay. It's going in the right direction, but it needs to continue to go in that direction for several years before we get to a level which is still unacceptable. But our key issue at the moment, as you'll be well aware, we set up the Violent Crime Task Force. They have focused very heavily on trying to take knives off the street, and they've taken thousands of knives off the street, along with other colleagues across the Met. But I think you've put your finger on the issue, which is the detection point. So what we are doing now is reinforcing the investigative capacity around knife injuries. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. We are looking to recruit more civilian investigators, and I think my memory serves me, we think we need, for the violent crime area, we need about 100, and we are on course to get that, but actually it's quite a difficult market, it's quite a tapped out market. A lot of police forces are looking for that sort of skill set, often retired police officers with investigative skills, and there's a lot of companies offering them different contracts out there. But we have started recruiting, and they are starting to work with the Violent Crime Task Force, and the intent is to improve the investigative side of things, get better evidence, get them in front of the CPS, get them in front of the courts, and get them dealt with properly in the criminal justice system. Whether that is incarceration or something else is a matter for the justice system. But we will make sure we can get more of them into that system. So that's where our primary focus is. We are continuing the work of the Violent Crime Task Force. It will be extended in
those
terms
officers
of numbers.
from transport are going to remain in it.
So they will do. There has been a slight deterioration and impact in their ability to perform over the last 10 days because of Extinction Rebellion. But to be honest, we've tried to protect them as much as possible. So it's only been a minimal disruption to them. And we think that's important because of the need to reduce violent crime. So we're continuing with our tactics around it. We're also looking on BCU. Every BCU has a violence plan, working with the local council, which is heavily focused on diversion activities to try to keep people away from the activity that might lead to those sort of offences taking place in the first place. So it's not just stop and search all the time. We are trying to be more nuanced in terms of, yes, on-street presence and enforcement, but also investigation to get to the right end, but also diversionary activities to try and keep people away from that level of violence.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, have you got any specific actions you want to highlight that you've taken around this issue of knife crime?
Well, on top of the investment from the Mayor that I've already outlined around accident emergency units in the major trauma centres, there's obviously the funding into the Met for the Violent Crime Task Force. There's the setting up of the Violence Reduction Unit and the programme of work and the programme of investment that they have outlined and that the Director Liv Peck has outlined for this year around keeping children and young people safe at specific times, around working with schools, but also around working with young victims of domestic abuse. To put some specifics around that, last year in December 2018, the Mayor announced a collaboration with Google to announce over £500,000 award from Google to work with young people around social media. There's been a plethora of activity around interventions with young victims around violence. We have increased the amount of money and the number of support workers for young people from 10 to 20, so that when young people have been victims, not just actually victims of crime, but witnesses of violence, that these young workers can can be sent in to work with the communities and those young people. We have funded the regional manager for Crime Stoppers, which is an important aspect of trying to improve the amount of information that's coming through to the Metropolitan Police. They are certainly activated, and I know they've been activated on a number of occasions in recent murder inquiries and in the aftermath of recent murders, to really try to encourage people to come forward with anonymous information to enable that investigation to go forward. And there is also the work that we are doing on gangs with the London Gang Exit Programme, the extra money and extra investment that has been put in by the Mayor to increasing and sustaining the London Gang Exit Programme. And of course the work that the investment from the Mayor with the co-commissioning fund, which in particular a programme which we have recently published the results of, the first year research around rescue and response for young people who are caught up in county lines and who are victims of abuse, sexual violence and grooming, who have been sent outside of London. So I think across the piece we've done a large amount of work and investment in enforcement and supporting the Metropolitan Police to suppress the violence and enforce it, but also in that sort of longer term intervention and prevention and safeguarding of young people.
A lot of projects there. Sounds. I mean, the Google one. It'd be useful if we could have something in follow up, because that sounds very interesting. Just to give us that detail. But how are you personally ensuring oversight of all these and to know what is delivering and what perhaps isn't, so you can prioritise for future years?
Over the last year, I've been chairing the Knife Crime Executive Board, which was I personally chaired that, which had all partners around the table. Brought all partners around the table to look at what was happening in London, where the barriers were for progress and what needed to be developed. We are now moving that into a violence reduction board, which will oversee the work, which will be part of the partnership coming together around the work of the violence reduction unit, sitting beneath the partnership reference group, and I will continue to chair that to ensure that on a regular basis we are able to work out, not just work out, look at what is happening and make sure that we are quickly taking actions if there are any barriers, or quickly taking actions where there is a need for extra action in a particular area, whether that be through the assessment of the knife crime action plans that the violence reduction unit has undertaken, or whether that be through working with our partners such as Probation to ensure that they are prioritising tackling violence in the way that they should be.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me move on to another issue, the issue of the gangs matrix. I think you promised that you were going to have a complete overhaul of this by the end of the year. I'm just wondering if you're on schedule with that, and also are you satisfied that what comes out of this revised gangs matrix will actually really be an accurate tool to monitor gang members as posing a risk to the public?
So we're working, the Deputy Mayor is well aware of this through her role. We're working very closely with the Information Commissioner. They've given us some very specific requirements in relation to the gang violence matrix. And we have taken action on the back of that. On the 4th of October, we got a letter from the Information Commissioner agreeing that many areas of concern had been addressed and recognising the intention to comply with the notice. So I think that's basically their way of saying you're on course. And we are continuing to work with them to put the matrix in a place where they can give it a clean bill of health. We had to take some steps since the notice, so we've ceased to share the gang violence matrix in its entirety with partners until we've got agreements in place around data sharing with all of our partners, and I think that's an important aspect of it for public confidence. But I just need to be clear, we continue to be sure that the gangs violence matrix is an effective tool for us in trying to deal with violence, gang violence, and try to interdict that violence and get people out of that lifestyle.
So by the end of December, you anticipate you will have a revised matrix that conforms with what the Information Commissioner has requested.
Exactly, and we are being helped along that path by the Deputy Mayor with oversight.
Good. Okay, did you want to come in on this specifically?
Yeah,
It's
just to both of you, and I think, Sophie, you were at a meeting where this was a top high priority issue in Hackney, and I'm just wondering, given the delay with this whole thing and the concerns felt in the communities that clearly it was the black community in some localities, including my own constituency, whether as soon as possible some sort of summary or an overview can be brought together so that we can then return to the discussions that were had at local level about this. One of the biggest attendance I've seen at HCVS was about this, and it would be good to feed back to communities about the actual actions and the latest, if you like, whatever protocol that's been agreed.
So I'm well aware of all the concerns in the community, and I'm not sure I was at the most recent meeting, but I have been at meetings in Hackney HCVS around where the gangs matrix has been raised, as I have with other communities across London. There hasn't been a delay in the work on the gangs matrix. When we published it last December, we said that we expected...
No, there was a delay prior to that.
Right. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So we are on track. I'm confident that we are on track, and by the end of this year, calendar year, we will be in a position to be able to report back on how how the recommendations of the review and the recommendations of the ICO have been implemented. The Metropolitan Police have already put information on the website and information around the gangs matrix, which are some of the early things that needed to happen. I have chaired a community reference group, but I'm obviously aware that that's not getting out to all communities and all people, but we will be communicating, and you're right to raise that in terms of trying to improve the trust and confidence around the gangs matrix and around its operation and how it is and its impact and its effect. But I'm confident that we'll be able to do that by the end of the year.
Well, maybe it's a conversation I could have offline with the chair of this committee.
That's great, thank you. If I move on to other questions I've got, one of your pledges, Deputy Mayor, is about making metal detecting knife wands available to every school in London, and in your report it says 250 schools have currently taken this up. Are you satisfied with that?
It is. Our commitment was that for those schools that wish to have them, that we would, if they wanted them, we would give them a knife wand. At the moment, that's around 250 schools that have asked for them. We are looking to see whether there are more schools that need them and whether we need to replenish the stocks. It's for, this hasn't been, we're not sending it out to every school. It is for a head teacher to decide whether they need one, and we are very happy to provide one.
Are you doing any more work to encourage schools to take it up? Or?
We'll be looking at that through our school, through part of the distribution of it was through and the communication of it was through the Safer Schools officers going into that, and we will be looking at that.
Okay, and moving on to the Safer Schools officers, what is the latest number of these officers? And can you just clarify for me, is it one dedicated full-time PC per school, or is it that there's a named officer but they work across 3, across 5, across 10 schools? Could you just clarify that, please?
So I think the model, the answer to that last part of the question is the model varies. It's not, I don't believe it's set. So in some areas there is one officer per school.
And that's their full-time job, they're in that school the whole time? That's
my understanding. But in other areas there's a shared element. I'm trying to navigate this to find the figures, because I do have them somewhere. Apologies. I'm not going to find them. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to find the figures in here. Just too much information, I'm sorry. I need to hang on. Schools and youth officers. The target, this is schools and youth combined, not just schools.
And what do you mean by youth? Can you just clarify that for the record?
It would be youth engagement officers who have a wider remit than being simple. They're not attached to schools.
But these are police officers?
They're police officers, yes.
Okay.
So the figures I have are target strength for sergeants for those two areas is 51, and we have 47 in place.
That's the youth ones?
No, sorry, this is sergeants.
All right,
involved in both schools and youth work. I can't split them up. I don't have them split up. So for sergeants, we want 51. We've got 47.
We've got
47.
47 out of 51. Okay.
And for the constables, our target is 484, and we have 395.
Oh right. Okay.
But it is. My note here is the HR data makes it impossible to differentiate between the two categories, say for schools
fine.
officer or youth. So I can't tell you what the figures
That's
are.
different to what's in the other information we've got here, which is in MOPAC's annual report, which says there were over 450 in post, and you've just said there are 395 in post, and it's going to increase to 550 later this year. And you want to go to 484, so that's different to...
I'm not trying to excuse differences, but I mean, if you add the PCs to the sergeants, it comes to 500,
yes,
530
that's probably
something.
where the difference is coming in. Okay, potentially that's where it is. You said some areas it's one per school, in other areas it's shared. What's the maximum number of schools?
Sorry, I don't know, but I can find out.
That would be helpful, I think, just to really understand their roles. That would be good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now I wanted to move on to the HMI report that, it was quite critical in some areas, obviously not all areas, but once again, and we go back to the ongoing HMI reports around child protection that have highlighted significant areas of concern. In the latest report, one missing persons unit showed 77 people reported missing in one day, but only 3 staff on duty in the unit. And the caseloads for officers, they're struggling in this area, but also in the area of managing registered sex offenders, up to around 100 compared to 60 in 2016. Is that acceptable, and what are you doing following this Peel assessment and the other HMI reports to try to manage that?
So the figure I have in terms of registered sex offenders managed by our sex offender managers remains about 60 offenders per manager. That's what I'm looking at. We're working hard to recruit and put more officers and staff into our safeguarding units. We are trying to increase. We are increasing in numbers, as we discussed earlier in the meeting. But we acknowledge these officers are under pressure. I'm afraid it's one of the situations that happens. The more that we know about offenders, and the more offenders we know about, the more there is a demand for safeguarding for the public from those offenders, which is entirely understandable, and that's our job. But it does mean with more data we have, and our appreciation of even greater risk from people, then there are more vulnerabilities for us to try and protect against, and that weight falls on a number of officers and staff who aren't growing as fast as the data grows and our knowledge grows.
The Peel report does say that offender managers now manage around 100 registered sex offenders each, compared to 50 to 60 in 2016. This was in the September Peel report.
Yeah. Well, so
you disagree with their figures?
Well, we've had some work done, and what I've got is the average figure of RSOs managed by our managers is about 60.
But this was also criticised, I recall, in the last HMI
It was, yes.
report.
I'm not saying 60 is a good figure.
So are you putting additional resources in there to deal with that?
Well, as I said earlier, we are looking at where our growth will go, and we have to come to the best decision on that, and that will be I'm sure that Mark Simmons, the Assistant Commissioner for Frontline, will be putting that near the top of his list in terms of I need reinforcements here, and I'm sure a lot of borough commanders will be, or BCU commanders will be as well.
It did say in the Peel assessment, the force should ensure frontline staff are aware of the registered sex offenders in their area, so they can play a part in monitoring and managing them. So that's potentially working with safer neighbourhood teams and others for perhaps some of the lower risk offenders, so they can help manage it. Is that something you're looking at?
One of the actions we've got coming out of the HMI report is that neighbourhood policing teams be appraised of the top registered sex offenders on an ongoing basis in their area. And that again feeds back to, if we reinforce the dedicated ward officers with the extra numbers, we will expect more results from them in terms of managing the sex offenders at a slightly lower level. Obviously the lower level offenders.
Yes.
Leaving the specialist unit at the centre of the DCU to deal with the higher threat people, and it's trying to get to that balance.
Which is something you're moving to.
We are, yes.
Okay. The Peel inspection also raised concerns about how the Met protects vulnerable people, particularly children. I think you have said in your response it's going to take a further 2 years to ensure children receive a consistently improved response. Is that good enough?
When you say, do you mean the Met said that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure who said that. So.
Okay. I think it's in my briefing. Just trying to see where that is. I think it must be in your response to the HMI, the Met's response, that it will take a further 2 years to ensure that children receive a consistently improved response.
So I think what if that's in our response that we put together.
No, that's the HMI noted that the Met told it that it anticipates work to ensure children receive this response will take a further 2 years.
So I think that's anticipating the fact that we will be reinforcing the area. And we're continuing to be under scrutiny from the Deputy Mayor on it, and we want to improve, but we're not going to say we can do that overnight. Recruiting the staff, so we can't simply take people in, you know this, we can't take brand new recruits and put them in there. They have to have a level of experience and maturity and professional training to deal with it. It will take time to build that workforce up. There's been a lot of change in that area. We know, because I think we discussed at our previous meeting, that's driven some vacancy levels. That needs to stabilise, and they need to be reinforced with new people coming into the organisation and then gaining the experience to go in, which is probably why we've said there'll be a time period of a couple of years.
I understand what you're saying. I just seriously worry that we started out with the previous sort of HMI reports and the quarterly inspections of how you're treating children, vulnerable children, and now 2 years plus on from that, you're saying it's still going to take another 2 years. That's 4 years, 5 years before the Met is really guaranteeing a child in any part of London will get the consistent and high quality service. I personally find that really worrying. Does it worry you and the leadership in the Met?
Yeah, it does worry me, but I'm afraid the daily life in the Metropolitan Police Service is now and has been for a number of years, certainly as long as I've been in it, managing risk and balancing that risk. Do we make sure that we've got enough firearms officers on the streets to deal with a terrorist threat? Do we put more officers and staff into teams to protect victims? Do we focus on the domestic abuse side? The answer is we need to do all of it, but we need to do it in a programmed way. I believe that the way the Commissioner is leading the organisation is a careful, considered, but dynamic move forward across the broad front. And and I know we always focus on the negatives in Peel reports, but if you actually look at what it says in the positive, it talks about the organisation moving positively in the right direction across a broad front, because it's got a good plan, it's got a Commissioner who's clear on what she wants from her people and is determined to deliver it. And do I worry about child protection? Do I worry about domestic abuse? God knows, yes, I do.
Yeah. No, I accept there are good things in here, and I have read it.
Yeah,
I just particularly around children is the area I often focus on, and I just want to make sure you're fully.
I think it's also, I chair the oversight group, and I have done since the original HMIC report came out. And I totally understand your questions, and they're probably the same. Well, they are the same questions I ask. And is this? Can you do this faster? Can you improve more consistently faster? And can you prove to me that the outcomes for children are better? And these are just, the classic questions that are right to be asked of the Metropolitan Police. And I think it's right to say that there has been quite significant progress in child protection. There's been, and the HMIC also do acknowledge that. And we, in terms of the work that we undertake and I undertake with the Metropolitan Police in really assessing that progress, I can see that coming through in the audit reports, and you can see improvements. So I think whilst there is still some way to go, we are seeing improvements in the way that the Met engage with and look after missing children. We're seeing improvements in police protection, and we're also seeing improvements in child sexual exploitation, the reviews around that. So there have been improvements. There is still a long way to go. But I also think we've seen improvements in the managing of risk. When you talk about the registered sex offenders, the caseloads, HMIC is right to raise that, but also through the work that's happened since the original HMIC report, there has been a new risk assessment, and the Metropolitan Police are much better at assessing the risk of registered sex offenders. And that is an important thing to acknowledge. But yes, there does need to be another sort of step change and more progress made, but it is not that there hasn't been improvements, and there hasn't been an improvement in consistency as well.
Well, I hope through that work you're doing your own dip sampling, because that is what's very telling in the HMI reports when they have done those samples. Some are very, very good, but there's still too many that are not giving the outcomes that children
Absolutely.
should have.
And if you take, for example, improvements from the DIP reports, overall grading in a review of missing children shows an improvement. The number of cases from inadequate to requires attention, they are moving. You can see it, and that is what I look at, and you can see that moving. It needs to move faster and better, but it is moving.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next section, which is quite appropriate given that this is National Hate Crime Awareness Week, and after some of the scenes we saw on television last night in Bulgaria, where the FA chair did remind us that we've got problems at home as well. Assemblymember Shaloni, standing together against hatred, intolerance and extremism.
Thank you, Chair. Just to you first, Deputy Mayor. So obviously we know that the Mayor launched the Countering Violent Extremism programme back in December 2017. Could you just take us through the next step for this programme, please?
So the next sort of practical step around that programme is to deliver the small grants programme, which has been linked with some of the extra funding from hate crime. There's £1 million that's been set aside in terms of the small grants programme for community groups who will be working with young people around countering violent extremism and radicalisation. I'm hoping that we'll be able to launch that soon, and that we'll get bids through that soon, and so that we can have those programmes up and running before the end of the financial year.
That's great. So if you could keep us updated, especially in terms of which groups have been funded, that would be really good. Obviously, the Chair's mentioned the really distressing scenes yesterday from the England match, and you'll be aware we recently launched a report, quite fitting, at Chelsea Football Ground on the 30th of September, where our report last year found that across London, some really shocking statistics. Homophobic hate crime had gone up by 81%, racist and religious crime up by 107%. Disability hate crime up by 215%, transphobic hate crime up by 261%. You've responded to our report, and you said that clearly a lot more needs to be done. Could you give us some practical measures in terms of what you think you and the Mayor could do to respond to this really growing issue across London?
In terms of practical measures around responding to the really shocking figures you've just read out, one of the things that's obviously an important role of MOPAC is to commission victim services, and to make sure that those people, adults or young people who are victims of hate crime, have the appropriate services. The Mayor has put extra money into the victim services, including specialist service for hate crime victims, LGBT victims, extra money into monitoring and supporting victims of anti-Semitism as well as community outreach programmes for victims, upskilling those community organisations who are working with victims of hate crime. I think that's an important practical thing and programme of work that we have undertaken, because as I said, one of the key areas for us as MOPAC is making sure we have the right services for victims of hate crime, but also importantly is an important aspect is also making sure that we raise awareness of hate crime, so that those who are victims feel confident to report. We have supported financially, as well as in other ways, the National Hate Crime Awareness Week, which I went to the service in St Paul's on Sunday evening, which was the start of the Hate Crime Awareness Week. It's always a very moving and important ceremony and service. But we have also made sure that we are putting funding into looking at how do you prevent, how do you work with communities to tackle hate crime before it starts. So working with schools, we have a programme, Heartstone Interactive Schools programme that we've invested in, which is working in that way. And then there's the work of the hate crime the Central Hate Crime Hub from the Metropolitan Police in investigating and trying to bring perpetrators of hate crime to justice as well. There is a way to go on that, and I'm very aware that there hasn't been, the number of detections and prosecutions around that is not high enough given the instance that you have already pointed out.
Yeah, and just on that last point, I think that's one of the things that our report really did focus on. So there's a range of proposed work which I think are in the right steps, especially the rollout of the Met School Education Programme, which we think is really vital and important. But in terms of hate crime offenders, our report focused on the fact that we feel that a lot more needs to be done, because I think there's unfortunately a cohort of people who feel that it's a victimless crime. So what more do you think that could be done to address the fact that a lot more focus needs to be given to the offenders of hate crime?
I agree. I think with everything every bit of our work, you have to look at supporting the victims and then working with the perpetrators, catching them, and then working with perpetrators so that they don't re-offend. And that is just as important in the sphere of hate crime as well. The Central Hate Crime Hub is part of that process to ensure that investigations are as good as they can be, as well as ensuring that where there's hateful material online, that is taken down where it is causing harm, and it is it's crossed that boundary between free speech into hate crime, and that is important. And there have been a number of occasions when hateful narratives on the internet have been taken down because they have crossed that line because of the work of the Central Hub. I think the Metropolitan Police has increased the number of officers working in that Central Hate Crime Hub. It's recruiting two more police constables to add to the team that's there already. And Claire Waxman again is chairing a London Hate Crime Board, which again with partners brings together partners across the piece in making sure that spectrum of activity is coordinated, and especially important hearing the voices of victims of what they need and how they'll feel best supported in order to take investigations forward.
You just mentioned additional officers. Obviously, the figures being bandied about in terms of how many additional officers London will be receiving. Maybe this is one for Sir Stephen, and I know that you can't get involved with operational issues, but is there any way or focus that some of those officers will be dedicated to this really important area? Or is it too early to tell?
For me, I think it's too early to say, and I don't understand to sit here and make promises to you around that. But equally, we take it seriously. I mean, on the issue topically of the hate crime at the football match last night, I noticed that one of the things we are going to do is provide specific hate crime training to our 16 dedicated football officers who work with all the football clubs in London, so that they are more focused on it and up to date on the training and awareness, and can pass that on to the club through their liaison with the clubs. We know it's an issue in London, but we need to deal with it as best we can. And I think that's a good way of doing that.
One of the things in our investigation was the fact that the Met is really good in terms of dealing with hate crime, but there's still obviously areas for improvement. Our initial findings found that their police response to local hate crime was quite worrying. Right. Is there more that you could reassure us in terms of officers dealing with that locally, where again we appreciate the just finite resources and the fact that officers are having to deal with more complex issues locally, but actually again the statistics show that this is all going in the wrong direction.
I get that. I know that we'll be replying to you by the 31st of this month, in relation to the recommendations, and I've got some of the sort of initial draftings of what we're going to say. One of the issues is that we need to ensure that frontline officers are properly trained, up-to-date training on recognising and dealing with hate crime, and understand, as much as somebody who's not receiving it, the impact it would have on the victim, and that's something that we will be covering in training going forward for all frontline officers.
Thank you. Just finally, Deputy Mayor, it was welcome that there was recently increased funding for the Catch Hate Crime advocacy services. How far do you feel that this will? You touched on the support for victims, but how far do you feel that this will go in really addressing the demand, which in a sense continues to grow in London for hate crime victims?
Well, I think it's an important addition to the investment around hate crime, support for hate crime victims, but I'm not going to pretend that it's going to fill the gap in the demand. The extra money that the Mayor announced at the beginning of the week as part of National Hate Crime Awareness Week was an extra £500,000, some of which is going to catch, and that's going to support around 900 victims. So you can give you an idea about the demand and the capacity. Not all the victims will need the services of CATCH, which is the Community Alliance to Combat Hate, but it gives you an idea that there is a significant gap in the ability to provide the services and those individuals and victims of hate crime who need it.
Thank you. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Andrew.
Yeah, Sophie, I think it's for you. To what extent do you think that the divisions and the aggressive discourse around Brexit have fed this growth in hate crime?
Well, we saw that, didn't we, when after the referendum and the result of the referendum, we saw a spike in hate crime. We're extremely concerned, and we can see that when there are specific incidents around any of those political events, such as Brexit. I think the discourse around Brexit is extremely worrying, because it is so dividing and it is so divisive. And when we get to that point in public narrative and political narrative, where people are being treated as other, people are being treated in that divisive way, and the language and the vocabulary that we see and hear day to day, it has an effect on the cohesiveness of our communities, and then it does have a knock-on effect into the way that way that hate crime is perpetrated. It is extremely worrying, and that is one of the reasons that we've put additional money into communities and into the services for those who are who are victims of hate crime.
Well, what I can answer you is saying I know we shouldn't have to put 60 police officers outside of the House of Commons and the House of Lords to protect people who work there on a daily basis. That shouldn't be happening in our society, and it is.
I can just finish off by asking you, Sir House. I'm glad that you said, and I quote, we recognise there's an issue in London. You talk about football clubs, and I think recognition is half the issue. I mean, if you don't recognise the issue, then how on earth can you form strategies to deal with the problem? And I think the police liaison officers actually, I've met with the hate crime unit, the Met's hate crime unit. I think you're doing some excellent work. You need to be commended. Things have improved a lot. Where I find the problem is, and I've done my own survey of London football clubs and their response to hate crime. Some clubs, I'm not going to name them, have been excellent, absolutely excellent. And some of the smaller clubs who've got no resources, relatively speaking, have been very, very good. And some clubs, quite frankly, have just been smug. And I think what I'm looking at is, through your hate crime liaison officers and football liaison officers, there's no limit to what they can do. We need more positive messaging from the clubs. And under Deputy Mayor, you will be responding to our recommendations in due course. But I'm hoping those are areas you can look at, that these people do have a massive social responsibility. And it's not just about being complacent. They can't rest on their supposed laurels. They're only doing a fraction of what they can do in terms of education, messaging, on match day, encouraging much more friendly atmosphere, and so on. So I think that's the message I would like to pass to you, to your your liaison officers. It's about actually shaking some of these clubs out of the inertia. You don't have to comment on that.
I'm sorry, I was reflecting on my experience in Scotland in dealing with sectarianism at football matches. And it's one of the most difficult things to deal with. I mean, it's one of the most hateful things as well. I mean, 99% of people go to a football match to enjoy or suffer watching their team play. It's not to get that sort of abuse and be in a crowd with that sort of thing going on. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to deal with, and really reflecting, it has to come from the clubs and the players. And I'm actually quite encouraged by the reaction of a great many of the players to this. I mean, in a sense, essential to they're the victims in much of this. It's directed at them. I think they respond in general in a very good way, and I think they're the ones that will drive the behaviour of the fans, the people in the crowd, and I think that's the way. That's probably the way to go. The clubs, the players, and get people just thinking about it. Much as you say, Chair, in terms of awareness, impact, and the sensitivities around these sort of things, and the behaviour needs to be, and the clubs need to take action. If they identify and can evidence it, these people need to be prosecuted, and as importantly, and sometimes more importantly for them, and to demonstrate to the other people in the crowd, they need to be banned from life,
Absolutely
for life,
right.
from any football match in the
Absolutely.
United Kingdom.
I mean, one of the groups that gave us evidence is Hope Not Hate, who've done an excellent report. They do a yearly report, but they've actually documented some of the links between organised gangs,
Yes.
professing a certain ideology,
Yes.
and the activity on the terraces, which in turn sort of contributes to,
Well, you know, Chair, you all know, we've seen, and Neil Pursue's been very clear on it, we are seeing an increase in right-wing violent extremism.
Yeah.
And in my view, there is some linkage between that and the views expressed in some football grounds, both in this country and abroad. Certainly, when we see our teams play European teams, some of the things that occur in Europe, and when the European teams come over here, very, very extreme views, racist views, often quite strongly politically aligned in a way that we just don't see in this country in the main.
Well, before I hand over to Silvana, but can I again commend the international work that you're doing, because I've seen some of it firsthand, spoken to people, and the work that I think has improved beyond recognition, the Met and generally all police forces over the last few years. So credit due, very due.
Thank you.
Chair, it's just I wanted to commend you for the work that you've done in leading this issue, and it's like what Sir Stephen said about the invidiousness and the sort of just lack of understanding that is underpinning this. It's really beyond belief. Many years ago, I remember in my locality walking and an Arsenal fan wearing an Ian, what's his?
I don't know.
Footballer Ian
Wright.
Ian Wright's T-shirt, turned round and called me a BB, you know, and I said, "Hey, we support the same team," and he said, and I got more racist verbal abuse. Yet there he was, wearing the image of his hero, of his football team.
Probably tells you a fair bit about the mentality, doesn't it?
And so there's sometimes the mentality is beyond belief.
I'm as one with the chair on this issue, but just for the sake of balance, I'm someone who does go every week to watch my London football team, who have a majority of black players most days, one of which torments the opposition supporters, never been subject of direct racial abuse, although apparently there's been some Twitter abuse of that footballer. What happened last night in Bulgaria was shocking, but from my experience, pleasingly, we don't have as bleak a picture in this country, but we need to be on top of it.
And on that note, let's move to the next section, which is a better justice system for London and Assembly Member Arbour.
This is really for you, Deputy Mayor. We've constantly said that, and the Mayor has constantly said that he wants additional responsibilities for the justice system, and we have been promised by MOPAC that you are going to come to us telling us how far this devolution has gone. Can you firstly tell us, is it going anywhere? And if it is going anywhere, what is it you want devolved?
So, as you know, we signed the first memorandum of understanding last year with the Ministry of Justice and London Councils. It's a tripartite memorandum of understanding. And in terms of is it going anywhere, yes, it is going somewhere. I believe we are the only PCC or only force in the country which has had devolved down to them the witness care units to the PCC and the funding for that. So we have now, from April, when we commissioned the Integrated Victims and Witness Service, that included the witness care unit for London. That is not happening elsewhere. It is a devolved package which has seen much greater integration for the support for victims and their journey through the criminal justice service. We have made really good strides around female offending as part of the memorandum of understanding. We have got sign up to a blueprint across London, which is a holistic blueprint for how we work and intervene with female offenders to enable them to bring down their reoffending rate and to enable them to be diverted away from custody. Those are two specific examples that came out of the memorandum of understanding, and there was further work which was signalled in the first Memorandum of Understanding, we have been working with the Ministry of Justice very closely to develop that further with 2 key themes around tackling disproportionality and tackling violence. We're doing well with those negotiations and those discussions. We're hoping to be able to sign another Memorandum of Understanding soon. And I'm sorry to say this, but it is true. One of the problems that we are having at the moment, because in order to progress it, is the fact that many civil servants have been pulled off this type of work to have to work on Brexit, and of course we have had a churn of ministers. We have each minister that comes in has been, you smirk, but it is true. Each minister, you know, we had very good relations with David Gork, who is no longer there. We had very good relations with Edward Argar, who is now being promoted to the DWP. So, but, however, each minister that comes in, when they are briefed and brought up to speed with what we are doing with the Ministry of Justice and what they are doing with us, is very positive. And I really hope that we will get to sign a Memorandum of Understanding, the second one, which will have proper, more devolution within it for female offenders, for piloting some transition arrangements, but we have still got a little bit of way to go on those negotiations and discussions.
What's on the shopping list? I mean, irrespective of changes in personnel, your shopping list presumably has remained constant. I think you've only told us about services for female offenders, apart from the matters which are already in the Memorandum of Understanding. It's not a very ambitious shopping list, is it?
We have 5 key areas that we are looking for in terms of devolution and working. One of the largest and the most ambitious is around the Probation Service, and wishing to have, and this was partly in the first Memorandum of Understanding, but it's absolutely something that we are working and want to ensure that we have sign-up from all 3, and it's obviously especially the Ministry of Justice, around the new ways in which we will be working with the Probation Service around a co-commissioning for rehabilitation services, not the core probation service. That should stay with the Ministry of Justice. That is core, not the employment of the probation officers, but those rehabilitation services like the Through the Gate services, which are there for offenders, which will bring together the support services that they need to really enable them and support them not to re-offend. That's a large part of it. We are continuing to push on victim services, because the victim contact scheme at the moment is not a devolved budget and is not devolved. It sits separately within the National Probation Service. That is more complicated, and although it sounds like a small service to be devolved, that is very ambitious in trying to ensure that we bring together all the victim services, and that bit of the victim contact scheme comes together and is devolved down to London. Again, as I said, these are things that we are still negotiating and discussing with the Ministry of Justice, and we are also looking for around youth justice arrangements in London. We are looking to have a pilot around transition arrangements in London for when a young person, as you know, when they reach 18, they often just fall off a cliff edge and are then put into an adult institution which is extremely harmful for them, and they are not. So we are looking for some transition arrangements around that. Again, these are things that we are discussing and negotiating, and we wait to see whether we'll be successful on that. But those are the types of things that are on our shopping list.
I have to say I'm quite impressed, actually. And I say that without any guile at all. There's no doubt that
Made by day.
one of the mistakes, I think he was probably before your time, of Mr. Grayling, was the problem with the Probation Service. It was an absolutely terrible mistake in my view, as far as that's concerned. Tell me, what exactly do you mean by commissioning in relation to the Probation Service? Does that mean that that MOPAC would be setting up some kind of supervisory body to see that probation, which I understood was going to be provided direct, was going to be taken back in-house, but from what you said, it isn't being taken back in-house.
So that's the difference that I was talking about in terms of it is being taken back in-house after 2021, because they put the contracts back out to tender. Obviously, that is a very complicated process for the Ministry of Justice to run. That's the difference that I was talking about in terms of the core probation service. We are not looking to have that devolved down to us. It's those services that probation themselves commission out.
Things like hostels.
Possibly hostels, but more around, you know, for example, if you were to be an offender leaving prison, you should be having some support services, you should be having services taking you to housing support, you should be looking at what possibly your mental health needs are, or your other interventions that are needed. At the moment, that is done through the contract with the Ministry of Justice. We are looking to have that as a co-commissioning alongside the Ministry of Justice. How far we get with that will depend on the negotiations we're having at the moment, whether that means that we have the budget devolved down to us or that we'll be co-partners. I'd like the budget devolved down to us. I don't know whether we'll get there.
Yes. You've told us, again, going back to your point at the beginning about changes in personnel, is the Ministry of Justice sympathetic to what you're proposing for the Probation Service?
Mostly it is sympathetic in terms of the rehabilitation services, yes, but the question is about, I'm being brutally frank with you, the question is about how far a budget will be devolved down. I'm not sure we'll get to the budget being devolved. Yes, I think we'll get that co-partnering.
I guess that we as a committee would look at budget after it had been agreed in principle that we might get this. The principle of devolution, though, to us, in the way that you've outlined, is something which, my guess is probably not a ministerial decision, that the civil servants are willing to see as a way forward.
So we have had we've had really good productive conversations with, not just conversations, really detailed work with civil servants and the officers in the Ministry of Justice.
Okay. And when do you anticipate that we will know more about it?
Well, that will depend if there's a general election. I'm not being flippant. I'm genuinely not being. It will depend if the general election's called really soon, because we were hoping to have signed something, and it's been delayed because of all the pressure on the government. It will depend. My fear is that we will not get there because the general election will be called quickly, and we will not be. We'll have to wait, and then there'll be different ministers again.
Again, and I think this is for you, Deputy Commissioner. In regards to devolution and MOPAC's oversight, is one of the difficulties that we have with the administration of justice in London connected with the number of cracked trials, because police have been unable, for example, to produce witnesses at the appropriate time? Is it perhaps connected with the CPS not being adequately briefed? Are there things, in other words, connected with the administration of justice and their interaction with police? I don't want to use the word failure. Police shortcomings in getting when the trial date is set that the trial has failed. Is there any way in which police can get a better grip over ensuring that cases go ahead?
So it's a pretty complex picture, and the person who really understands it from the police point of view is Nick Fgrave, the Assistant Commissioner, who chairs the London Criminal Justice Board, and I have to say does so very effectively. He is also the national lead on criminal justice, so has a very good understanding of the whole system. He's working very hard on our disclosure issues with the CPS, but it is a very complex picture. I mean, as an example, the average length of time for a rape case to get to court is now 18 months from the commission of the offence, and that's because of digital evidence, disclosure, requirements for evidence from third parties, etc., etc. I mean, and the conviction rate for rape is pitifully small because of the length of time and the complexities involved. You could take that across many of the more complex cases these days. I have to say, I regularly read in the newspapers, oh well, the case failed because the police officer didn't turn up. I have to say, all I can do is tell you this is what I've looked at. Every time we look at one of those, it's never that simple. So the most recent one was exactly that, where the officer didn't turn. It wasn't publicity, it was an internal report. The officer didn't turn up. Well, the criminal justice system, the trials are complicated and take a long time. And in most cases, the officer's not required. If all of a sudden there is a quick movement from defence and prosecution go along with it, right, we can hear it today, if the officer wasn't warned, there's nothing the officer can do about it. It's a complicated picture. We're working very hard with the CPS and with the courts to try and improve performance.
Well, there is a particular aspect I want to take up with you, and of course we've all been on visits, you know,
Sure.
in relation to rape, and we've heard about the digital evidence and so on. One of the things, we've already briefly discussed it with questions from the Deputy Chairman, is lack of confidence in policing. One of the things which must have a very profound effect, if people are all teed up to go to matters going to go to trial, the witnesses have been warned and everybody's been there, and there is some failure which has occurred further back in the system. I suppose it's possible that a police officer hasn't properly been warned, or a piece of evidence hasn't appeared in court, but that kind of thing has a very wide-reaching effect on lots of people. It's not just some person being stopped in the street and gets arsy about it. It's huge numbers of people are involved with that. Is there no way in which we can take a grip, MOPAC can take a grip on that for, I don't know, running the witness service or something of that kind? Not directly running the witness service, but commissioning it?
Well, MOPAC, I might speak for MOPAC, but we know that there is investment going into supporting victims through the criminal justice system. And part of that is to try to get them made slightly more resistant to the damaging effect that time has in relation to, and potentially one trial after another, and big delays, and think people aren't ready, etc., etc. And support to a victim can help them get through that, because it helps them to understand this is going to take a long time. But it shouldn't take 18 months for an average rape trial to take place. And that's partly to do with disclosure issues, partly to do with the digital side of it, and the fact that we have to have massive investment and technology and the use, I'm afraid, of artificial intelligence to sift through the huge amount of data that we're now being asked to provide in cases.
Thank you. Right. The next section will be really quick. Assemblymember Hall's not here, so I'll do the questions, and Assemblymember Pigeon may wish to come in. But it's about the Met's budget. Well, firstly, Deputy Mayor, when do you expect to appoint the new chief executive of MOPAC?
Well, actually, I wrote to you around the appointment of Siobhan Peters as interim chief executive. I hope to go out to recruitment very, very soon in terms of recruiting for us, you know, a permanent person to come and take up that post very soon. So if we go out to recruitment now, the earliest we could possibly get it done would be, we'd be pushing it at this side of Christmas, but hopefully we'll be able to do that. If not, it'll be early January.
And then in terms of the budget, there's been a near 20% increase in MOPAC staff. Why was the scale of increase required, and what benefits has this actually brought? 20% increase is fair bit.
So one of the things that I said at my sort of introductory remarks was that I was very pleased that we'd been managed to lever in extra investment. A lot of the extra staff are there because of the extra investment and the need to, you know, you have to manage the disbursement of funds. For example, we got money from the Police Transformation Fund for Drive, the Drive programme, which is working with perpetrators of domestic abuse. We have to have staff in order to, one, to set that up, and two, to make sure that those, you know, what the money has been spent on is spent right and it has been delivered in the right way. And that goes across all the different areas that we have managed to get extra investment. And then, of course, that's extra investment from external bodies like the Ministry of Justice or the Home Office, but then the Mayor has put extra money in so that we have had extra resources around violence against women and girls. Again, these are commissioning of services, which I know you'll agree and understand that to commission and to deliver services in an efficient and effective way, you do have to have the staff. in order to do that. We are absolutely in line with the sort of perceived wisdom around how many staffing ratios to size of budget for commissioning. I would say if you look at the staffing levels of MOPAC, we are relatively small in relation to our functions purely as a police and crime commissioner, not around the commissioning of budgets, the scrutiny functions. We are absolutely in line with other comparable police and crime commissioners. We are not out of kilter with that, and we are overseeing, as I said in my introductory remarks, the largest force in the country in the most complex capital city, one of the largest cities in Europe, and we are in line with the functions that are needed to do that.
I was actually going to ask you how you compare with other forces, and I know it's difficult, you can't compare like for like, but so you touched upon that point. Before I move on to Sir House, Flo,
I want to come in on that, we'll pick it up next time.
Just mindful of time, so obviously you're saying that the additional pressures that the Met Police are facing. In terms of some of the work that MOPAC and the police are bidding for, do you feel that there's been any benefit in securing some of that funding and essentially getting more staff in MOPAC to bid for that? So, for example, some of the work on the A&E advisors and A&E youth workers in A&E departments, or the advocacy advisors.
So the extra money which has either come in externally or from the Mayor, in terms of the extra staff that are managing that extra investment, they are temporary members of staff, they're not permanent members of staff. It's not adding to the establishment of MOPAC, if you wish. In terms of what the outcomes are for enabling that to happen, the extra money, as I said earlier, some of the extra investment has enabled rape crisis centres to reopen their waiting list. It's enabling extra youth workers to go into accident emergency units. I have visited the Stalking Assessment Centre myself, MASSIP, and it has enabled hundreds of cases to be referred to them for proper investigation and proper support for victims of stalking, which hadn't been taking place in the way that it should have been before. I've been to visit a DRIVE programme in Croydon, which is working with perpetrators of domestic violence. Really innovative work taking place down there. My hope would be, and we are evaluating this, and I'm sure that's probably one of your questions if you have time, how do we evaluate this work? On those extra programmes through the police transformation funding, we are evaluating them at the moment as to whether, have they given value for money, have the outcomes been the ones that we expected, and has it had sufficient impact? We're evaluating that at the moment so that we can look to see whether we can find or bid for extra funds to continue them, because the police transformation funding will come to an end in March 2020.
And I think that's one of the things that we will be looking at in one of our future meetings in terms of MOPAC's commissioning role. Nothing more from me.
Just very quickly to use Deputy Commissioner. I mean, we touched upon commissioning and other stuff that MOPAC does, and they obviously fund a lot of support services. But from a policing perspective, is there any benefit in funding these services, such as youth workers in A&E departments? We saw something about that on the news last night. Would it impact policing if these support services were taken away?
I mean, I think I should say, of course, MOPAC is our oversight body. I'm not there, so I'd be careful about what I say about. But on the other hand, the commissioning services you've mentioned, a couple of those you've mentioned, it's not a case of consulting, but we're very supportive of any activity that will work to protect the victims of domestic abuse, support them, will protect and reduce violent crime. As far as I can see, the commissioning services that are being commissioned are in the right area.
Thank you. Fine. So the last section, if you do exit the European Union on the 31st October, this will be the last chance for the police committee to ask you about the implications for policing in London. And Assembly Member Isma.
Well, first of all, Stephen, if I could ask you if you could update us on the preparedness of the Met for a no-deal exit on the 31st of October, should that happen. Obviously, you've told us about the 60 officers outside Westminster. Is that going to be enough? What are the things we're going to need?
Well, we don't anticipate it will be enough on the 19th of October when Parliament is sitting, and we've also got a significant number of march protests in London, which we will police as we do. So yeah, there will be peaks and troughs. So I chair the Brexit readiness group for the Met, and we've met regularly. We've looked at all aspects of policing. we acknowledge there's always something potentially that will come out of left field that people haven't thought of, but we work all the way from the operational implications in central London through to resilience on BCUs, through to our staff. And we have nearly 1,000 who are non-UK EU citizens, and the implications for them, and I think they are all in a pretty good place and understand that we will be supportive of them, all the way through to our contracts and those that we've got contracts abroad, and how will they continue post Brexit, no matter what happens. So we do look at a wide range of issues. We believe we are as ready as we can be. We have as you would expect, we're running a risk register on that. We believe we've mitigated risks as far as we can.
And there have been discussions in the media about mutual aid with other forces.
Yes.
Particularly Northern Ireland, for example.
Yes.
Are we involved with that?
We've trained a number of officers for mutual aid in Northern Ireland because they have to be trained in slightly different tactics, because officers are armed with sidearms in Northern Ireland, and clearly ours are not and wouldn't be when they went out there. So the public order situation is slightly different, so they've had the training for that. But I think in previous answers, as I said, I don't anticipate a huge number of officers going from the Met to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's first port of call for mutual aid is usually Police Scotland. And they have a substantial number of officers trained in Northern Ireland public order tactics. However, if there was a crisis and we were asked, we have been net recipients of mutual aid in the last week and will continue to be so for however long it takes. The whole system depends upon two-way working. So we would provide mutual aid if it was required. We would anticipate, however, quite a potential for quite high public disorder around protest in London. Run-of-the-mill, so people's vote has been to London in the past with big numbers, entirely peaceful, entirely lawful, and therefore didn't require a huge amount of policing. Our concerns are if pro and anti groups come together on the 19th, that may be more of a challenge for us, but we are geared up for it. Despite other demands that we have on us at this moment in time.
And, just continuing the theme of mutual aid briefly, have we had, or are we prepared for requests for mutual aid from forces with South Coast ports?
We are. That's been talked about at a national level, and I represent the Met occasionally on a national group chaired by the Permanent Secretary in the Home Office who looks at these sort of issues. So that's in discussion, and again we would be prepared to provide if it was required.
And the other issue I want to address is the consequences of Brexit, not in terms of public order and so forth, but in terms of crime fighting. And Neil Basu, the Assistant Commissioner, has talked about the replacement's not being as effective, and I think there's a whole list of things that's been identified, including the European Arrest Warrant, Schengen Information System, European Criminal Records Information System, Europol, Eurojust, and so on. Can you update us on progress that's been made in discussion with the Home Office on arrangements for information sharing and extradition post-Brexit?
So one of the things that was done very early on in policing was the setting up of the International Coordination Unit here in London, which has worked very hard in the last 12 months, I think, to put in place as many mitigating factors as we can for the loss of connectivity that we are going to suffer if we exit from the European Union. So, and the one you didn't mention, which I'm sure Neil did mention, is that we will no longer be able to be a member of Europol. Instead, we will fall back on our existing membership of Interpol. Europol is a very effective organisation, and that will be a loss. The loss of SIS2, the Schengen agreement systems, and a variety of other ECRIS, the European Criminal Record Information System, means that we will be operating at a lower level, and we will have to work harder to mitigate in some areas. In some areas, you saw in the Queen's speech yesterday, the red notice made an arrestable offence, which effectively means that if Interpol puts somebody out as wanted, the new legislation, which isn't in yet, will give officers in the UK, possibly England and Wales, probably the UK, a power of arrest on the basis of that red notice from Interpol. We don't have that at the moment, so we could check somebody and Interpol could say they're wanted for something. We wouldn't have a power of arrest at the moment. We need to put that in place.
So on the information exchange arrangements, how are we going to be significantly worse off than where we are now?
We will be worse off.
And can you give us some examples of the sort of things you can do now that you won't be able to?
Well, at this moment in time, when a police officer stops somebody on the street and carries out a person check, name, age, sex, height, etc., and checks that person's identity to see if they have a criminal record, at the moment that check flashes across the whole of the European Union. In future, it can't do that. Now we may, which means of course that if we stop somebody in London, they may turn out that they are wanted abroad, or that there is criminal intelligence about their behaviour based on something they've done in Europe but not in England and Wales or the UK. That will not be as easy to get, because that information flashes across Europe hundreds of millions of times a year at the moment because of the number of checks that police officers do in this country. And the vice versa will be true when officers in Europe do the same thing. That link will be broken, and as I understand it, we will have to re-establish bilateral agreements with each of the countries. And much like trade agreements, there is optimism, but it takes time to do that. So there will be a loss in relation to that, also a loss in relation to criminal record history. So we won't know as much about people, and I think the figure is 1/3 of the people that we take into custody in London are foreign nationals, including currently EU. And half of that 1/3, so about 15%, are non-UK European nationals, EU nationals. So we won't have as full a picture of these people as we currently do, and we'll have to build that up.
So overall, it's not good news.
I think I'm very clear in saying policing has been clear from the start. There will be a degradation in our ability here. We've always said that. We've been open about it. We've worked hard to try and mitigate as much as possible. I think we've put a lot of mitigation in place, but it won't be at the level it is right now.
Sophie, can you add anything about discussions with the Home Office about trying to do anything with this?
I mean, there's just not that I hesitate. Well, not hesitate. I am a bit lost for words because there is no good news in this at all, and it is about losing substantial information exchange. And that sounds a little bit dry, but I think the Deputy Commissioner's already outlined what that means in relation to people on the streets of London who the police might want to question or need to know, find out their identity, and they will not know whether they are wanted for serious offences outside of Britain. And that's just one part of dropping out of Europe without a deal. This is if we don't have a deal. I would just say, Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu said it would, if we go out with no deal, it would create an immediate risk that people who come to this country who are serious offenders, either wanted or still serial and serious offenders committing crimes in this country, and we would not know about it. It creates that risk. That risk is substantial. It's hundreds of people. It is a real worry, and that's just about the information exchange. You then have European arrest warrants, you have passenger information records that aren't going to be exchanged. It all sounds a bit dry, but it is actually the meat, it's the bread and butter of policing in London and the country, because it's about data. It's really, really important. I'll just finish with it. I went to Harrow probably about 8 months ago for a public meeting around, it was actually around antisocial behaviour and some of what was happening in the public along the high street. The local DWO said in that meeting that they had been working with the street drinkers and working with those that were causing some of the problems that the local residents were complaining about and was really affecting their lives. The local DWO said in that meeting, we ran this person's name through the database, and we found out they were wanted in Europe. And that's just one small example in a local public meeting of how often that information is used and needed.
You know, the government's published Operation Yellowhammer on some of the implications of Brexit, which has been published. Have they produced a paper with some other bird name in relation to the implications for policing, security and public order?
Well, in terms of the work, Richard Martin's been leading that for the Met and nationally. We know where the issues are in relation to the information agreements and the tools that are used, which Deputy Commissioner has been through, which includes the European Criminal Records Information System, includes Schengen, includes the European Arrest Warrant. That has been worked through by the International Crime Coordination Centre at the cost of millions of pounds. It's about £7 million already that has been spent on doing this, which is particularly frustrating given the lack of funding that, you know, the funding that we need for police officers on the front line. And we also know that if we fall out without any deal, the impact that that will have, well, extra officers are going to be needed just to deal with trying to get through the cases, and it will only be those cases of real high risk. It will not be the lower down cases which the police are actually dealing with now.
But has the government produced a paper, like it did Operation Yellowhammer, on some of the economic implications for policing, security and so forth? I know they've not published it, but have they produced one? Stephen, do you?
There has been significant discussion at a number of government-led meetings around the implications. The government's well aware of the implications.
Have they produced a paper with a bird name, like they have for other things? That
Well, the only bird name, the only,
Another
It's in
name.
June, so that's the end of it, really.
the only bird name I've seen is Yellowhammer.
I'll
So
be the first to see it, Andrew.
I
Don't
haven't
worry.
asked to see it, I'm just asking if it exists. Like they've got one for, I think, called Kingfish, if they infect on poor people. Well, they just want, is the one or isn't the one?
I haven't seen
don't
a
know.
specific paper in relation to that. There's been a lot of discussions about it. It is high up the Home Office's agenda in terms of concerns. I know that.
I mean, if at the root of your question is the government taking the security implications of Brexit seriously enough? No, it's not. Because if it was, it would have had a separate agreement on security and taken it out of the deal.
Ending on a wonderfully political point, Deputy Mayor.
Sorry. Well, yes, it was.
She didn't
But
actually make a point because you interrupted.
Point, I think. Security and safety point.
it's,
Well made. Right.
Okay, right. Can I thank our guests for attending today and for the answers to our questions? Can I ask the committee to note the discussion and the report from MOPAC attached at Appendix 1 of the report? Noted, thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the progress on our work programme as started on the report? Noted, thank you. Next meeting is on the 30th of October at 10 a.m. in the chamber. And on 30th of October at 10 a.m. in this chamber. And as I have no other urgent business, I now end this meeting.
GLA Chamber Sound.